Ideally, the donors should be all voluntary donors, and we must avoid first degree relatives. It is very common, at least in the first transfusion, for families to say that, an uncle or aunt directly gave the blood. That actually increases the risk of developing antibodies in these patients, which may lead to, subsequent complications, alloimmunization, transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. And if we were to take this child to transplant, that may actually adversely affect the outcome of transplant. So it should be voluntary donors. The blood should be tested for hepatitis B, C and HIV, and it is ideal that it is tested by the NAT technology and not by ELISA. Now, all of our patients are not having access to NAT tested blood as of today, but it is getting better and better. The blood should also be screened for malaria. Again, it could just be, with the slide test, but it is ideal that we use a malaria antigen because it is difficult for a Blisi blood bank to screen for malarial parasite. For children with thalassemia, the guideline is that they should receive blood which is less than 2 weeks old. Now, coming specifically to reducing the risk of alloimmunization, one of the strategies that we use is leukodepletion. Leukodepletion, in addition to reducing alloimmunization, has other advantages because it virtually eliminates febrile transfusion reactions, and it also lowers viral transmission of a number of viruses such as CMV. Leukodepletion could be done pre-storage, which is really the ideal way to leukodeplete. But where this is not feasible, currently patients are using bedside filters. The problem with this is that some of the blood that has already been hemolyzed, the cytokines are released, and it may not eliminate febrile transfusion reactions completely. So the ideal would be pre-storage 3-log leukodepletion of all blood transfused. Alloimmunization develops in up to 10-20% of these patients, and the incidence actually depends at what age patients started regular transfusion. So patients who have NTDT, who may need transfusions at a later age in life, actually have a much higher incidence of alloimmunization. To limit this, blood banks use certain strategies. Firstly, before embarking on regular transfusion therapy, patients should have extended red cell antigen typing that includes at least C, D, E and KEL by either molecular or serological testing, and this is possible for virtually all blood banks today. Patients should be transfused with ABO and RH, extended RH typing and KEL compatible blood in order to avoid alloimmunization against these antigens. Where it is not possible to transfuse each time extended blood type, then at least when they run into problems with antibodies, then at least we can start screening and giving them the blood that is antigen free for the antibodies that the patient has. All patients should have an antibody screen prior to each transfusion, which tells us whether we need to study the antibodies in more detail and give them specific blood. And if we use these strategies, we can actually reduce significantly the risk of alloimmunization.
All right, thank you, Dr. Meeta. So, Dr. Manas, these days we are having lockdown because of the COVID infection, and otherwise also the blood is not that freely available for maintaining good hemoglobins in these patients. So in this scenario, when there is lockdown, how you are managing the scarcity of blood for availability for transfusion?
I think, this COVID-19 issue has just changed our worlds completely, and we were totally unprepared. We did not know what to do in every sphere of our life, whether it is medical, whether it is social, whether it is personal. And such is the life of thalassemics, because this is getting affected because of this COVID-19 issue. And the first impact comes from basically the availability of blood products. Now, what is happening is that, donors are scared. They don't want to come to the blood banks. They think that they'll have contact with people who have corona and that will affect their lives. They are worried because there is no transport available. There is financial crunch in their lives. So, that is kind of, changing their mindsets, whether to donate, not to donate, and many such things are coming into the minds of people. How do we address this issue? Because this is a big challenge and it is going to stay with us for some time. So what needs to be done is, from the point of view of hospitals, from the point of view of charities, from the point of view of NGOs that are working day in and day out to change the lives of thalassemics, I think the blood donation drive has to be more strong, powerful, and more vocal. We need to change the myths, and we need to let people know that, if we are creating a safe environment for them to come and donate, if there is proper social distancing at the blood bank where they are coming and donating, if we are able to arrange some transport facility for them, probably the donation drive would improve. We need to call up the voluntary donors. We need to tell them that, the hospital, this area is completely corona safe. There is nobody who is coming. There is good hand hygiene being followed. There is proper social distancing. And these patients are in desperate need for blood transfusion, and this will improve their, motivation to come and donate. Now, big hand can be played by social media. All the time people are sitting on WhatsApp and just reading every possible trash that is coming onto us. And, even we are victims of that. I think we need to put this in social media that, blood scarcity is there. We need to improve our blood donations and, motivate them through newspaper, through television channels, and from whatever media is available, so that people can come and donate. Sometimes transport is something that is a problem. So, we need to give them letters that, they can come to the hospital, they can donate, and no police is going to stop them from coming and donation. So I think if we take these few measures, the scenario will improve and will help the patients because they are struggling at the moment with the blood donations.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Manas. So my next question is to Dr. V.P. Chaudhary to tell us about what is the current concept for adequacy of transfusion, what pre-transfusion HB levels to be maintained, and what are the challenges in maintaining these pre-transfusion levels in the desired rate. Dr. Chaudhary, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jagdish Chandra, for calling me, and good afternoon to all participants and the people who are listening to this webinar. Once we have looked into it, the diagnosis and the adequacy of blood, the one objective is that we need to maintain an hemoglobin where growth, development of a child is maintained as near normal. And there have been various bodies, right from Thalassemia International Federation, Indian Academy of Pediatrics, the Canadian Association, UK Thalassemic Society, all have at least come to a conclusion over a long period of studies that at least their minimum pre-transfusion hemoglobin level should be between 9.5 to 10.5. And I take a midway, which means we need to maintain hemoglobin of 10 gram round figure before transfusion. And that is the adequacy, and this data has shown long-term studies that if we maintain the hemoglobin of 10 gram, the children growth, the height, their weight, and the complication of a chronic anemia like effect on the heart, cardiomegaly and other, they do not disappear, which means that the 10 gram hemoglobin pre-transfusion levels are adequate, and one should make all out efforts to maintain their HB levels to this level. Can go to the next slide. Now here in that I did mention that that is our basic level to be maintained. Before that we reached to this conclusion, there were many studies where they maintained a palliative hemoglobin low levels, then hypertransfusion, supertransfusion, or the neocyte transfusions were done to ensure that we are able to give an adequate blood. When we were giving palliative was that we were giving that much blood to sustain the life of an individual. And over the period what we learned that these children developed thalassemic phases progressively. They had growth retardation, they had hepatosplenomegaly, and therefore this was no longer followed, and then went to the opposite side, that was the hypertransfusion or a supertransfusion, where the hemoglobin was being maintained around above 13 grams. And then one found that this level is, blood requirement is more and it doesn't serve an additional purpose. To minimize the blood transfusion requirement, the idea came, why not we give a neocyte transfusion which had a prolonged life of a red cell survival. But when it was not cost effective and not practical, therefore it was given. So after all this, the current modern therapy, what we decide is between 9.5 and 10.5 gram, or 10 ka dam, one may say, for in Hindi language, local language. That was the consensus, and now it has been recommended by all various bodies that this level should be maintained. Now you have asked me, can you shift to the next slide? What are the struggles? Now the one is that though these children, we counsel them, we sit them when the transfusions are maintained, but still at a national level, what we have observed that the parents still are not well educated, so are the patients. Sometimes they have a difficulty that they have to travel long distances from their home to this. You know, when we started daycare facility at AIIMS, I was getting a patient to Delhi as far as Allahabad, Bikaner. Amita will know when she was working at that time. So the patient had to travel overnight to come to get the 1 unit of a blood transfusion. And it is still unfortunate that in local places, some of my colleagues, they are though expert, they still feel that the blood hemoglobin should be maintained below 8 grams, around 8 grams. And some of them still believe that if we maintain hemoglobin around 10 grams, the blood transfusion requirement will go up, which is a false belief. And they believe that if this blood is given, this will add to more iron overload, and therefore we'll have to give more chelating drugs. I think one concept is very clear, that if we maintain at 10 grams, the blood transfusion requirement never increases, it remains the same. It normalizes the growth and development. But these are the challenges, the beliefs amongst the parents, the children, their distance problem. Other is the poverty. The people who are below poverty line or education level, which shall be showing the data subsequently, is where their hemoglobins are maintained poorly. Then, of course, you know, in metro cities, blood is still available, though with certain difficulty. But if one goes to a periphery, let us say district places or even smaller towns, the blood is not that freely available, and the people find difficult in maintaining the hemoglobin. And then there are problems with the family. For example, the child is having exam, they won't come for their transfusion. Child is, they have shifted or gone on a vacation. Child has exams, they have gone on a summer vacation, family trips. And I always emphasize them that if the child's hemoglobin is good, he will perform better in the school and wherever. His activity will be more normal. But in spite of this, these are some of the factors which we have been observed. And if we shift to the next slide, Dr. Jagdish Chandra, this is a data of 1800 odd thalassemic children from Bangalore, from 4 different centers, and they are very clearly shown that the patients who are below poverty line, the poor education level, and particularly the females, their transfusion levels, hemoglobin levels are poorly maintained. They have gone, recently another paper has come from the state center where they have shown that the children who are poorly maintained hemoglobin, they have hepatosplenomegaly, even their morbidity and mortality over long-term follow-up compared with the same age groups are higher than in this group. So therefore, it is very clear that we have so many problems of maintaining their hemoglobin, and these are our difficulties and challenges which we need to face.
All right. Thank you, sir. So after we are done with the issues related to the transfusion, we are all aware that with every unit of blood that is getting transfused, a lot of iron is also transfused. And we have to, that leads to the problem related to iron overload. So Dr. Amita, I would like to ask you how to assess the iron overload in these patients with thalassemia. And is it that serum ferritin alone is enough, or do you need to do some other tests?
So followed, after optimal blood transfusion, the next most important component in optimal management of thalassemia is chelation and monitoring. And really we can only deliver optimal chelation when we have a good test to monitor. So there are number of modalities available such as ferritin, such as T2 star MRI. We had other experimental procedures such as SQUID, and we no longer resort to liver biopsy. So for all practical purposes, it's really between ferritin and T2 star MRI. Now ferritin has been very useful and we continue to use it extensively because it is very easily available. It is relatively inexpensive, and though a single value may not carry a lot of information, serial trends are extremely informative about what is happening with iron stores in the body. It overall does correlate with total body iron stores, and we know for a fact that consistent elevation above 2500 is associated with organ dysfunction. Next slide. It does have its limitations because it is only partly reflective of what is happening inside the body, because it is only representative of 1% of the total iron storage pool. The level of ferritin, as we all know, can be affected with a wide variety of conditions such as inflammation, hepatitis, and vitamin C deficiency. But mostly if there is any reason for hepatic inflammation, it may be a very crude indicator of iron overload. Again, when patients have levels, very high levels such as above 4000, the relationship is not linear and we may not be able to make an accurate assessment with this, but it does tell us that there is a severe iron overload. The predictive value of individual values are poor, and that is why it is serial trends that we must use to understand what is happening in the patient. And again, patients with identical values may have highly variable iron burden. So again, the importance of trends and less value of individual values. One important thing to remember is that if you have a very high ferritin value and you have tried to optimize the chelation or added a drug, just simply absence of declining ferritin does not exclude response, and that we must bear in mind. Another important limitation is that it underestimates the liver iron burden in patients with NTDT or thalassemia intermedia, because the way they have iron overload is very different. It is because of increased absorption from the GI tract, and ferritin is not a very good predictor of iron overload in these patients. Next slide. So these are the limits, but saying that is still the modality that is available to each and every patient that we treat in our country, and we still rely heavily on ferritin, though we understand its limitations.
So in line with the previous question, the next question is also for you, Dr. Amita. What is the role of MRI scanning in present-day thalassemia care? And so at what age we should start doing the MRI for the heart and liver?
So the MRI scanning has really emerged as the most important that we have in our armamentarium to assess iron overload in children. And the MRI technique that we use in these children is T2 star. It is actually interesting because this discovery was made accidentally. When MRI was evolving, it was just seen that patients with very high load have show different kinetics, and whether we could use these physical and mathematical properties to assess iron overload. And from that, the journey of using this modality started. T2 star MRI is a special software that we use to assess iron overload, and it's actually a very brief MRI. It is a 7 to 10 minute MRI that can assess both the iron overload in the liver and heart, which are the two key organs affected in thalassemia major. The T2 star values correlate inversely with iron concentration because iron interferes with the magnetic field homogeneity and accelerates the transverse signal delay. One important thing to remember is that though MRIs are much more easily available, this test is ideally done on a 1.5 Tesla machines. Most of our newer centers and hospitals actually have 3 Tesla machines, but to date, this test is still better done on a 1.5 Tesla machine. Next slide. This just shows how the heart looks at on the T2 star MRI. If you see the top, the first 3 images, these show what a normal heart is. But if you see the bottom 3 images, and specifically if you focus at the interventricular septum, which is considered to be the most representative area of interest for cardiac iron overload, you can see how densely dark the iron overloaded heart looks. And it uses, the T2 star MRI uses this property and the physical properties of what it does to the signal delay, and it converts into a quantitative figure. And this is the chart that we use, because if your myocardial T2 star MRI value is more than 20 milliseconds, that means that you have no cardiac iron overload. And the same way we have values, and less than 8 would indicate severe cardiac iron overload. Next slide. Again, this shows the prognostic information that we get from T2 star MRI. So if you have on MRI, you have severe cardiac iron overload, the proportion of patients going into cardiac failure in the next 12 months is actually, more than 50 to 60%. And if you have more than 20, the chances of the patient going into cardiac failure is actually close to 0. So it is an extremely predictive value that we get. This similarly shows the liver iron concentration on a T2 star MRI. The top 3 images are of a normal liver, and the bottom 3 images show the liver, liver that is studded with iron overload. And similarly, it gives us a very high liver iron concentration of 25. We again have numerical values that we use for liver iron overload. And again, the chart shows these clearly. So if you have more than 6.3, there is no iron overload. And if we have a value of less than 1.4, it is severe iron overload. Again, as we are getting better at chelation, some of these thresholds are changing, because we want everybody to be above 7 now. Many people have asked, if you have iron overload, you have iron overload. What is the point of doing all this heavy MRI? Well, if we have an accurate tool to measure iron overload, it really helps in motivating patients to comply with their chelation, because this can actually show what is happening in the organ, unlike ferritin, which is just a blood report. And they can see what is happening in their tissues. We can motivate them, we can adjust their treatment, and it shows that just by changing or moving to using MRI as a tool improves their outcomes. The age, Dr. Chandra, you had asked, it is an MRI scan, so really only children more than 7, but in my experience, really more than 10 are able to do an MRI without sedation, and we would not like to sedate these children for this thing. So it is really above the age of 7 to 10 years, when they can hold their breath for a short while, that we can do the MRI without sedation. And it is only at this age that iron overload starts to become a problem.
So one reason why we need the MRI assessment is that it gives you directly the organ iron overload. Second, as the ferritin is not very reliable, reflecting the total body iron. Third is that when we are using the chelators, the chelator chelates the iron differently from different organs. So we need to know the exact what is happening at the level of the heart, what is happening at the level of the liver, to titrate the chelation therapy. And very rightly said that the first this thing, the MRI could be done as early as possible, say after 7 years of age. But by the age of 10 years, one should try to do the first MRI, and then subsequent, depending upon what are the values. So next week.
So the challenges I just want to share is that, it requires a dedicated software. Actually, the original commercially available software is very expensive, and it needs an annual maintenance charge. And the radiologist needs expertise to interpret that. And this is accessible really in the entire country. The original software is available only at a couple of centers. But a lot of work has been done to improve access to this modality. So the first one, if I go to the previous slide, is a tool that has been developed by a cardiac radiologist and is available to all centers free of cost, where he has just used that you can use any MRI machine, and there is an Excel sheet that for both for 1.5 Tesla and 3 Tesla, and we can use our existing machines, and we have disseminated this information at many centers in the country, because Dr. Fernandez was here for a 2 years consecutively, and that has actually improved access to many patients, because this is a brief MRI, and if a center learns it, we can do like camps there. And this is another technique, which is an ultra fast MRI. This is a project done by UCL London, and again for the last 2 years we have been working on this in association with thalassemia support groups, wherein again this model is that if we have this ultra fast brief MRI, we can do it like a camp for 100 thalassemics over a weekend. So for the last 2 years, we have done this project where we have tried to do like a camp for 100 thalassemics, where you pay a small fee to an MRI center, or they can give it to us for free, and we can improve access of this excellent modality to the vast proportion of our children.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Mita. So, sorry.
That's it, sir. That's it.
Yeah.
Please go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, Dr. Sunil Gombar, once we have assessed the iron overload status, the job is to reduce it by using the chelators. So, what are the commonly used chelators? How do you begin with chelation therapy? How do you monitor? And how do you monitor the adverse effects of chelators? Dr. Sunil Gombar, please.
Yeah, Dr. Jagdish Chandra, there are 3 questions in one question, so I'll be try to be brief. Now, what are the commonly used chelators? There are 3 licensed chelators, as everybody knows, and the others gathering also would be knowing. The oral chelators are D-ferrosirox and D-ferriprone, and parenterally, subcutaneously, we use desferrioxamine. Next slide. Next. Now, coming on to the chelators, the first chelator, that is D-ferriprone, the age-old desferrioxamine was approved in 1960, followed by D-ferriprone in 1998, and of course it's not recent. In 2005, it was, that is, D-ferrosirox was licensed to be used. Now the doses are all mentioned here. The average dose is between 75 to 100 for D-ferriprone, D-ferrosirox 20 to 30. You can exceed up to 40 milligram per kg per day also. At times, if the chelation, aggressive chelation is required. And for desferrioxamine, the dose is 20 to 60. Now, route of administration is also shown here. Because the half-life of desferrioxamine is very less, so that is why it is given in the form of a subcutaneous infusion over 8 to 12 hours. Now, coming on to the half-life, that is why the half-life of this is very less, 3 to 4 hours. That is why we try to give 3 to 4 times a day, 3 times a day, and desferrioxamine, the desferrosirox we give only once a day. Whereas, as I said, desferrioxamine need to be given continuously through subcutaneous infusion. I think the pharmacokinetics is all there. Only thing which we need to now know is that side effects we need to know when we start on D-ferriprone. Then the gastrointestinal side effects, arthralgia and agranulocytosis. These are the 2 main side effects that 30% of the patients may develop arthralgia. Coming on to the secretion is there into the urine, and D-ferrosirox, the more important thing is the creatinine elevation, or the liver enzyme elevation. But then it does not require, you need to monitor them, and it is usually the creatinine is not increased more than 2 milligram%. Now coming on to the desferrioxamine, you have neurosensory deafness, neurosensory ototoxicity, you have visual toxicities, you have problems on the skeletal system as well, that it causes platyspondyle. I think, can we go back? So these are the side effects. So now when to start chelation? Now you usually start chelation after 10 to 12, 20 transfusions. When the ferritin level is increased more than 1000 microgram per liter, and then with new chelators, the chelation can be started little early also, trying to maintain the level between 800 to 1000 microgram per liter. Now coming on to the initiating, this is a very important question. Now various countries have started initiating the chelation therapy differently. Here it is mentioned like Europe, UK and Canada, they still start as the first line as desferrioxamine. But US and Australia, You see, deferasirox, especially to be used more than 6 years of age. So US and India, they start using this as a first line therapy. Now coming on to the India, most of us start deferasirox as the first line to start the initial therapy. Of course, like I am working in a government setup, and supposing if it is not available or the fellow has to buy, the cheaper modality would be to start with deferriprone. But then, as I said, if in his guideline, go back to the previous slide. The TIF started off with they start initially therapy with desferrioxamine. USA, as I said, deferasirox. Again, desferrioxamine. Italians, Canadians, they all start with the desferrioxamine. Next slide. Next slide. Now coming on to the yes. Can you listen to me? Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. Now, children between 2 to 6
Go ahead.
years.
You are audible. You are audible.
Okay.
Please, go ahead.
So children between 2 to 6 years, as I said, the first line of therapy is in the USA is the deferasirox, whereas I think this and the first line of therapy still stays in India. As I said, it is the deferasirox. Now contraindication is all there with the pregnancy. The time-tested medicine of desferrioxamine has been used in pregnancy, and that is the only drug which we can use. Next slide. Now trying to talk about the monitoring, the last logistically we have only one thing with us, and that is the serum.
You could do it, Hari. Yeah.
Sorry.
We have already done this partly, so you could hurry through these slides.
Go ahead. Next slide. I just want to highlight more. Next slide.
Yes.
These are the few drugs which Dr. Amita has already mentioned. I just here this slide is important, that FibroScan somehow has recently come up, and I wanted to talk. There is only one study I could lay hands on, and that is that a prospective study which was carried out in 154 patients, thalassemia major, and they conducted a study in a tertiary hospital in India only, and they concluded that FibroScan, which measures the liver stiffness, it correlates very well with the MRI R2 star. R2 star or T2 star. So the P value was significantly related. So if you have a facility of a FibroScan in some of the places, the sensitivity and specificity is pretty good. However, there was no correlation which was found between the serum levels of ferritin and the transient elastography, that is the FibroScan. So that is what I wanted to highlight about the few words about FibroScan. Rest all has been spoken. Next slide.
Modality that one can use as far as the liver changes in liver, rather its ultrasonographic features. They are there. Elastic nature of the liver is there depending upon the iron overload. So this is another thing. In addition to the MRIs, this has got added. So we now have covered the blood transfusion and chelation, and we would move on to the questions related to the curative treatment. But before that, a brief question on aluminization, which is sometimes a problem in children who receive repeated blood transfusions. So before that, there's a question on when to consider using chelating drugs in combination, and what is the combination that you will recommend. Dr. V.P. Chaudhary, please. Question later. Dr. V.P. Chaudhary. Dr. Chaudhary, is it? Is Dr. Chaudhary able to listen to me? No, anyway, so Dr. Amita, will you take on this question? Can you take on this question?
Dr. Komper has already explained. We now have 3 chelators at our disposal. And
Yeah.
when we consider combining them is when we feel that we are not actually achieving optimal, control of iron overload. And, as we have these chelators available to us, our aspirations in terms of what we consider optimal has also changed. Like previously, if we could bring it down to just less than 2,500, we were happy. Now we are targeting less than 1,500. And really, as a hepatologist, why should even 1,500 is too much? So we do not want to incur any organ dysfunction in these children if we want them to have healthy, long lives. So we are combining the second chelator.
Audible.
I think Dr. Chaudhary is back now.
Not audible.
Yeah, sir, Dr. Amita was...
No, I was never audible,
Hello.
So when we are combining drugs, we have to monitor them also even more prudently. So the indication to combine is to achieve more optimal overload, but then what combination we use depends on the iron overload. Where, for example, Defruxirox is the drug of choice to remove iron from the liver, while to remove iron from the heart, Defriperone is the drug of choice. So which drug we have also depends based on what our monitoring studies have shown. So and we have to then monitor them very carefully so that we do not increase the side effects in an individual patient. And at the moment, most of the published data is with two drug combination. Though some occasional centers, when they have been against the wall, when there has been severe organ dysfunction, even for a short time, all three chelators have been combined. So it is either Defruxirox with defruxamine, or we combine Defruxirox with Kelfer or Defriperone, and these are the two combinations that we have used mostly.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Amita. And in fact, this is the Indian experience from PGI Chandigarh. This combination of two oral chelator has been very successfully used in nearly 36 patients with a mean age of around 13 plus minus 7 years. So they showed a very good reduction of adverse the ferritin, and the combination was very well tolerated. Similarly, we used it in about 33 patients. We also showed a very good reduction, that is 35% reduction after 12 months and nearly 45% reduction after 24 months. And again, this combination was very well tolerated in these children with thalassemia when we used both oral drugs. And that is something very practical for country like ours, where the cost issue always remains. So thank you, Dr. Amita. Now we move on to this question regarding the aluminization. Partly this has been discussed while discussing about the transfusion therapy. So Dr. Manas, kindly focus on the problem and its diagnosis. How do you prevent and how do you manage? Dr. Manas Kalra, please.
This issue of alloimmunization has been discussed by Dr. Amita also. But because we have a few more attendees that have joined, I'll just briefly cover this. So whenever we are going to transfuse a person with blood and we have diagnosed that this person has thalassemia major or say NTDT, it would be really ideal to do an extended blood grouping at that point of time. Why this is important is that we normally do the common blood groups, but we also have to look at the minor blood groups in this person, because later when this person develops some allo antibodies to the donor blood groups, then if we have the original blood grouping of this person in detail, of this child in detail, it will be easy for us to find the to really cross match the blood to the minimum possible incompatibility. And that is why the recommendation that we should ideally do extended blood grouping and typing of every individual. Now this alloimmunization is basically an immune kind of a disorder, which is because of the incompatibility between the recipient and the donor. And because of this incompatibility, the recipient mounts an immune response and hemolyzes the blood that has been given, and that causes decrease In hemoglobin, the expected rise is not seen. The person requires repeated blood transfusions to maintain an adequate hemoglobin. He might become very sick if the amount of antibodies are too much. And this can be a big challenge in managing patients, either who have TDT or who have NDDT. Now, it was clearly shown that children who are transfused late have more chances of alloimmunization. And that is the classical scenario in a child with NTDT, when up to 4 or 5 years, people don't even know, parents don't even know that their child has some illness. Later they realize, either because of pallor or because of jaundice or because of splenomegaly, that there is some abnormality. They test the child, they identify that there is NTDT, and the hemoglobin is very low and the patient requires blood. At that time, when you are trying to transfuse this person and you have not done an extended blood grouping and you give blood, there is a chance that there can be a severe hemolysis, and this can happen in the future transfusions also. So old age at initiation of transfusion, more number of transfusions, splenectomized patients, allogenic WBC within the RBCs are all risk factors from the host which can predispose for a person to have alloimmunization. And there can be some ethnic and racial reasons also which can lead to alloimmunization in children. So the strategies can be really by doing a good extended blood grouping, and every time trying to cross-match the blood, identify the antibodies and make sure that the blood is very much compatible with the recipient, and then only transfuse that. If by any chance you find that there is some kind of a hemolysis happening, try to find the blood group compatible to the major and the minor blood group so that we can give a very, very compatible blood to this person and avoid alloimmunization and hemolysis. Now, leukoreduction, as was told, either bedside or pre-storage, ideally pre-storage, also helps in decreasing alloimmunization, and that can be a good strategy to prevent alloimmunization in person. As far as the issue of treatment is concerned, now this person should be managed in a center where access to a very good blood bank is there, where they can really identify all the incompatibilities and they can provide that kind of a blood which is completely matched to the patient. And usage of steroids is, conventionally the first line of therapy in such a person. Other drugs that are available to us are IVIG and rituximab, but most of the patients are managed with the help of steroids, and with that we are able to control the antibodies, and with a good blood group compatible transfusion, further complications can be managed.
All right, thank you, Dr. Manas. So we have seen that the management is quite like what we do for autoimmune hemolytic anemia, but it is not all that simple. These cases are really very difficult to manage at times, and therefore it's very important that this condition of alloimmunization has to be prevented by leukoreduction and doing a extended cross-matching every time we give a blood transfusion. Meanwhile, I have received one question on when you should think of starting chelator. So this, I think the person might have joined little late. When a child has been put on regular transfusion therapy, and as Dr. Gomber pointed out that when the transfusion received are something like 15 to 20, one should check the ferritin, and if the ferritin is above 1000 nanogram per ml, one needs to start the chelator. So I hope the listener has got the answer to the question. So Dr. Sunil, next question is also for you. How will you manage the thalassaemic child who is
muted?
It lags by about 4 years of age. The bone age is also less, and as I said, in the age group, the sexual growth also lags behind. Next slide. Now, what we need to see is that we need to monitor. You see, there are formulae to say mid-parental height. For a girl or for a boy, there are formula that you have mid-parental height you measure, then you find out by the charts that what is the target height. And if the target height is within 8.5 centimeters of the target height plus or minus, then it is all okay. But usually these children, then to find out what target height these children would attain, you need to find it out and you need to put them on the chart. Now monitoring the growth, as I said, you need to find out the endocrinal evaluation needs to be done. You need to do every yearly thyroid function test. You need to find out the assessment of the pituitary gonadal axis, that is LH, FSH. Need to measure the serum testosterone, estradiol levels. For pituitary growth axis, you need to find out IGF-1, and then you need to find out the growth factor binding proteins. For calcium homeostasis, that is for parathyroid, we need to do the calcium levels, phosphate levels, alkaline phosphatase, parathormone levels, and vitamin D levels. So basically for monitoring the growth, we need to do the endocrinal evaluation. For diabetes, we should start with the glucose tolerance test. Then sometimes there could be the IgA transglutaminase antibodies to exclude such patients the associated celiac disease. Now testing the hypothesis, testing the hypothalamic pituitary growth axis, then you should have the stimulation test, that is growth hormone stimulation test, which are carried out. Next slide. Now for the monitoring, continuing the monitoring of the growth, you need to have the radiographic evaluation for the bone age. You have the typical atlases there. You can try to find out by getting an X-ray. You try to find out the bone age. The bone age is retarded in such patients, and look for their skeletal abnormalities, especially the children who have, as I said earlier also, they can have platyspondyly after giving them desferrioxamine, so look for that. But that is also a cause of a short stature. And also you measure the bone mineral density by doing the DEXA scans. Next slide. Now, prevention of the growth abnormalities. As I said, the most important thing, of course, is you have to keep the pre-transfusion hemoglobin more than 9.5 or 10. Serum ferritin needs to be below 1000 nanogram per ml. Then the use of good chelators, correction of the nutritional deficiencies. If there is hypersplenism, you need to correct that. Early diagnosis, you see, when you are measuring them, the height, sitting height, the standing height, then early diagnosis and management of the growth delay and growth hormone treatment in patients with growth hormone deficiency needs to be found out. And properly timely management of the pubertal delay. You see, if you do the SMR scoring for these children when they are in the pubertal age group, and most of the patients, if they have a less SMR values, then you need to manage those patients as well. Next slide. I just briefly mention about, because this is most commonly asked by postgraduates or other people, that how you treat a patient, especially in a girl who has got a delayed puberty or an arrested puberty. You first, as I said, you do the SMR scoring, do the bone age. After that, oral administration of ethinyl estradiol is started. Initially 2.5 to 5 micrograms daily. Initially you give it for about 6 months, and then you do the assessment, hormonal assessment by LH and FSH values, serum estradiol values. If spontaneous puberty still does not occur, within 6 months of starting the treatment, you increase the dose of the oral estrogens, especially to 5 to 10 micrograms daily for another 12 months. And if breakthrough uterine bleeding does not occur, then you have to give a combination of estrogen progesterone. Replacement is to be done, and that is a recommended treatment. Similarly, for boys, next slide. For boys, you see, you assess the SMR and the bone age. Start with the very low dose of depot testosterone injections, and that is 30 to 50 milligrams for about 6 months every monthly, followed by again the hormonal reassessment. And in patients, you see, these children have hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism. So in these patients with hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism, the treatment at 50 milligrams per month can be continued till the growth rate is waning off. So you need to continue it for a very long time. Sometimes the total full virilizing dose can go up to 75 to 100 milligrams of depot testosterone that can be given. So this is how you try to manage the children with pubertal delay or growth, these disorders.
So very elaborate answer you have given, Dr. Gombar. Thank you. So the growth that we see in growth retardation that we see in children with thalassemia, it's not always related to inadequate blood transfusion. At times you have to look for other conditions like Dr. Gombar pointed out, even celiac disease or conditions where other endocrinopathies have set in. So that though they have to be addressed to correctly see that the child grows properly. Dr. Manas, there is a question from audience for you. At what stage you anticipate alloimmunization? Dr. Manas? Dr. Manas Kalra, are you able to listen to me? Yeah. When do you suspect alloimmunization?
So whenever the blood transfusion requirement unexpectedly goes up, and we are seeing that the patient is required much more blood transfusion than what his usual pattern was. Sometimes in the period of puberty growth, you can have a little increased blood transfusion requirement. But if this is accompanied with, say, jaundice and DCT coming strongly positive, those are some of the indications. And we do an antibody screen and we find that there are some antibodies. We suspect that there is alloimmunization going on in the patient.
Yeah, and sometimes it is the blood bank which tells you that there is difficulty in cross matching. So that is how maybe the clinical effect has not still set in, but at the blood testing level they find it very difficult to cross match. So that is how we get this. Another question in relation to alloimmunization is, Dr. Manas, you could take on this. Leukodepletion is mainly to avoid graft versus host disease. How we consider this as a preventive strategy for alloimmunization?
Sorry, I could not listen to the full question. There was some voice disturbance.
Leukodepletion, he says, is mainly to avoid graft versus host reaction. So how do we...
The leukocytes also have HLA antigens on them. And this leads to the formation of antibodies. So the leukodepletion has got multiple benefits in a patient. Not only in reduction of other complications, even CMV infection can be reduced with leukodepletion, and similar way HLA antigens present on the leukocytes can increase the risk of alloimmunization, and that is also an additional benefit. The other important benefit of leukodepletion is reduction of the febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction. So it has got multiple benefits, and that is why it is highly recommended in patients of thalassemia who are going to require blood transfusion for lifelong.
So there's a thank you very much, Dr. Manas. So another very interesting question I have received is why we do not monitor serum transferrin level on chelations for requirement of chelator. That is for iron overload. Why we are not looking at the serum transferrin level? Dr. Sunil Gombar, would you like to take on this question? Dr. Gombar?
This modality, serum transferrin levels, I don't think anybody is doing it. In the thesis only we got the serum transferrin receptor values.
Not receptor, only transferrin level.
Serum transferrin levels?
He is not talking of receptors. Actually, I suppose the transferrin saturation would be totally increased because of the serum iron, and this would not reflect the iron overload. That's probably the reason why such a simple test is not used. And this will not, Dr. Amita, you have to add something to this?
The transferrin saturation is reached very early, so that is why we cannot use it for
right.
measurement.
Yeah, it would not be, yes, that's right. So, all right, so we move on to the next question. Dr. VP Chaudhary, are you able to listen to me? Dr. Chaudhary? Any idea?
Yes.
Is he left?
No, I'm not left. I'm very much here.
Yeah.
Hello.
Okay. So, yes, sir. There is a next question for you. What are the common endocrine problems that we observe in these patients, and how do we prevent and treat them?
I think a lot has been said by Dr. Gombar already, and
Yes,
varieties of complications, endocrinopathies, primary causes iron overload in relation to the thalassemia patients. Then are the other causes. For example, like you mentioned, celiac disease or other problems associated, malnutrition, undernutrition can also be other factors. But when we talk of endocrinopathies in relation to the thalassemia, actually one concentrates that ones which are occurring due to the iron overload, that is a complication of a blood transfusion to these children. Now, if we look at the various data, the proportion varies. Of course, the commonest is a short stature, which is seen in almost 50%. You have projected already the slide, the endocrine complications. Are the delayed puberty and hypogonadism, which also occurs in about 54% of patients. The diabetes can occur in a varying proportion of almost 15 to 30% of patients in different series, hypothyroidism, hypoparathyroidism, hypogonadism, and other one. I think what more important in these next slide, more important is that we have to be proactive. That point which must be considered. For example, like we said, their growth chart should be monitored right from the day you are putting these children on daycare center on a transfusion at the age of 2 or 3 years. You are monitoring the linear growth on their growth curve charts. You are already monitored, put on their parental height on that. And then you are, of course, taking sitting height and other heights. And one has to be proactive. Right from if your ferritin levels are too high, 3,000, 4,000, 2.5, 3 above, even at 5, 6 years of age, I think one should start looking for it. If you are maintaining a good chelation therapy, at least every child periodically, initial, right from 7, 8 years of age on, prepubertal time, and then every yearly one should do basic tests. For example, like thyroid function test, glucose tolerance test, or calcium levels, phosphorus levels, and some of these tests, and even vitamin D levels, because vitamin D deficiency in them is also responsible for bone mineral density defects and other issues related to it. So one has to be very proactive, and why I'm saying proactive, that if you find, you are estimating, if while monitoring the serum ferritin and MRI T2 star, and if you find patient's iron load is over excess what you expect, or it is not maintaining around 1,000, you have to adjust your chelation therapy and intensify either with one drug or maybe use combination of drugs, whether 2 drugs, even at times 3, then I think the offer is that one must maintain the ferritin and be proactive and try to prevent the development of any endocrinopathies. Because once they develop endocrinopathies, the treatment becomes expensive. Now they need the treatment for the high.
Dr. Chaudhary, your voice is not there.
Lost, sir, lost. He is not disconnected.
Well, hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello, now, yes.
Yes, please.
High-tech problems. So one need to monitor this patient. For example, thyroid, by and large, rule of a thumb from 10 years of age on, one should do their thyroid function, glucose tolerance, serum calcium levels, vitamin D levels, and so and even their growth, and what already some tests Dr. Gumbar has already said, they should be evaluated. And once you make a diagnosis, if the ferritin level is too high, I think one need to intensify the chelation therapy by combination. Start the treating for that deficiency. For example, if it is a hypothyroidism, put them on a thyroxine, start with a small dose, and every 2 to 4 weekly increase the dose to maintain the TSH level to a desirable level. And many times it has been seen that moment you maintain hypothyroidism corrected, even sometimes their chelation dose also gets varied, and so one has to monitor and adjust those things also. If a patient has a hypothyroidism, you need a regular follow-up and replace with the thyroxine. Patient has a diabetes. Most of these patients require insulin. They are not able to maintain on an oral hypoglycemic agents. So one ought to adjust the treatment for diabetes and adjust with an insulin, and then you have to tell them the diet therapy so that they take diet regularly and take insulin, maybe 2 doses, preferably one can manage by that. And if a patient has a hyperparathyroidism, then one needs to give a calcium. In fact, to my mind, all children, right from the moment you make a diagnosis, the third arm should be they must get folic acid and calcium. And in fact, I always tell them they should get hepatitis B vaccination periodically. Coming to the hypoparathyroidism, we need to increase the dose of daily calcium and add calcitriol, and so that give them weekly to begin with, vitamin D high dose, and then measure the vitamin D level, and so that ensure their calcium levels are maintained. In fact, I'll say one should do a bone mineral densities also and add that parameter to maintain their manage their hyperparathyroidism and so on. So these are some things which are important while managing these patients with various endocrinopathies. And in fact, I always believe, I said proactive, one should tell the parents to begin with that if we maintain good transfusion therapy and chelation therapy, in majority of the patients will be able to prevent the development of the endocrinopathies, and one should counsel them repeatedly and monitor these patients closely. One needs to be proactive, detect early, and start treatment early.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Next, we move on to a question on the cardiac problem in children and how to prevent them. Dr. Sunil Gombar, this question is for you.
Regarding the cardiac problems, there are many. All problems are because of the increased iron overload. So you have usually they are reversible. They have myocyte failure, arrhythmias, including the heart block. Usually, to begin with, they start having a problem of the diastolic dysfunctions. So basically, it is the myocardial siderosis which occurs, which is restrictive in nature. So you have a restrictive cardiomyopathy, and diastolic dysfunction occurs much early. Patients can develop pulmonary hypertension, and there are arterial changes because of the loss of the vascular compliance. Next slide. Now the key points are, there is a slide in between as well. Yeah. Now after that, okay. Now I think I have cut the story short. That what I need to say that there are arrhythmias beach mein rakhiye. That slide was there. So basically, these children, because of the increased iron overload, they have a problem of the arrhythmias are there. They can have supraventricular tachycardias, ventricular tachycardias, premature ventricular contractions, atrial fibrillation. So this is all because of the raised iron levels in the heart. Now what happens is they usually present to us with palpitations, dizziness, syncope, and there is they may come with the dyspnea on exertion. So if this could be because of the arrhythmias. Then what I said was restricted, so diastolic dysfunctions are there. And if you have all those pictures, then how to treat it? So you start treating them. Usually antiarrhythmic agent which is used is amiodarone, and amiodarone can be used along with it. If there is a heart block, even at times the pacemaker can be utilized. So can I go to the next slide? Key messages. Now the key points are that cardiac dysfunction, usually it is very important. You don't wait for the clinical examination or for the overt heart failure. The dysfunction usually lags behind cardiac iron deposition for several years. So basically diastolic dysfunction will start occurring because of anemia per se. There will be cardiomegaly. So cardiac dysfunction at that stage is reversible. You have to maintain a pre-transfusion hemoglobin of more than 9.5. Keep in mind the normal endocrine functions, especially you have to have TFTs, good sugar controls. They also reduce the cardiac morbidity. Now, prevention of the cardiac iron overload and early recognition through an MRI have a much greater likelihood of success than waiting for the echocardiographic and clinical evidence of heart failure. You see, in our times, earlier times, before the we used to get the stress echo done. So those things, you see, they lag behind. Now we need to have the T2 star MRIs, and as Dr. Amita said, these T2 star MRIs, if it is less than 5 milliseconds, the scores are there, you need to start treating them much earlier. Now regarding the cardiac, the treatment for I mentioned about the treatment for arrhythmias. Now the treatment for heart failure, you need to have vasodilator. At times when you need to be very cautious about using the diuretics. I don't think we should try to use digoxin in such patients because the window is very short of it's a restrictive cardiomyopathy. So in those cases, vasodilators or ACE inhibitors have got a role to play, and some role is of the diuretics. That's all I want to say. Hello. Next slide. I think I lost the connection.
I think this is the last slide of your question. So, Dr. Gomber, there is a related question. Dr. Gomber? Hello.
I'm listening.
There is a question related to cardiac problem. That is, what are the less cumbersome methods to evaluate to correlate with cardiac overload? This is from Dr. Smita Mishra.
Yeah, Smita Mishra itself, she herself is a cardiologist. So this is a question coming from a cardiologist to me. What does he say? Hello?
What is the less cumbersome method to evaluate for the cardiac dysfunction?
For cardiac dysfunction, as I said, to begin with, you have to have the T2 star MRIs only.
Well, we were expecting she would be here and she would answer such questions. Anyway, we can discuss this later on. Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Gomber. We move on to the next question. Dr. Manas Kalra, this is regarding some upcoming thing regarding the management of thalassemia patients. This is the gene therapy. So what is the current status of gene therapy for thalassemia? Could you elaborate on this?
So, this is like the most, always asked question in thalassemia, because there is always that hope of something that will come for us and which will be, less toxic than a bone marrow transplant for patients. And, a lot of work is being done on gene therapy. So basically what gene therapy is, the gene therapy is that you modify the gene, the defective gene of the person, and give back that gene after the modification, or you do some technical thing inside the cell such that the gene is kind of changed and there is something, some kind of editing done in the gene which leads to production of the better to a higher level of hemoglobin. So it aims to cure a genetic disease by either replacing or by editing the defective or non-functional gene. So beta globin is the main gene which has been defective, and for years and years a lot of work is being done on to modify this gene to correct it. And you can see this nice sequence of how the gene therapy has evolved over the years, starting from way back in 2000 to the present scenario where it kind of looks like a reality. Now, why we need this gene therapy at all when there is a bone marrow transplant? Why do we need gene therapy? The main reason is that, everybody does not have a donor. And if you don't have a donor, in gene therapy, you're kind of doing a gene therapy and a transplant, but the transplanted cells are your own cells. So it is like an autologous cell being given after modifying those autologous stem cells. The advantage is that you don't need a donor. You will not have GVHD. The toxicity of the transplant will go down, and you will tolerate the whole transplant process easily. But doing the gene therapy itself is little difficult, complicated, and requires many steps. I will not go into the detail, but more or less how it happens is that you take the stem cells out of peripherally by giving GCSF, plerixafor, and all those agents. Now you take these stem cells and you correct them in the lab. You change the gene. Now either you insert a new gene or you edit the existing gene. You give conditioning chemotherapy to the recipient, and then you give these edited gene stem cells back to the person. Now because they are the autologous stem cells, the person accepts it easily, and the gene, the new modified gene, kind of produces hemoglobin in the person. Now where we are in reality, so Bluebird is one of those clinical trials where this agent called Zynteglo has now been manufactured, and it has been tested in humans. There are successful cases where anti-DT patients or beta plus patients are now able to have a 3 or 4 gram rise in hemoglobin. Some of the beta zero thalassemics have not had a full significant rise in hemoglobin to kind of become transfusion independent. Their transfusion frequencies are going down, but I think there is a lot of work going on even for these patients so that they can also become transfusion independent one day. And many of these trials have now reached into the phase 3 trials, where a lot of patients have actually become a kind of transfusion independent or have become, requiring less amount of transfusion in their day-to-day life. So yes, it is becoming a reality, not for us in India at the moment, but those who are in clinical trials abroad have had a lot of success in the recent past with these new technologies that are being used.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Manas Kalra. So gene therapy would be a answer to the non-availability of donor for a transplant. But as Dr. Manas Kalra pointed out, this is a very, very difficult process. First, you have to mobilize the stem cells from the patient, edit or correct them, and then put them back into the patients. Though there are the patient's own stem cells, but still some kind of myeloablation would be required. So certainly not something which every pediatrician would be able to do. I'm sure like you need a special transplant team for doing a bone marrow transplant. But there is something new that has come up.
So like to mention that cost is also going to be a big.
That's right. Cost is going to be very innovative to start with. Right. Very right. So there is something that the general pediatricians could be able to do regarding these patients, that is using certain drugs which could reduce the transfusion requirements. There are several drugs which are used for reducing the transfusion requirement in thalassemia patients. What are the new compounds which are being evaluated and what is the current status? This will be discussed with us by Dr. V.P. Chaudhary. Sir, please. Dr. V.P. Chaudhary, please.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Everybody able to hear me? Dr. Jagdish?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. The first thing I'd like to emphasize is that we have been talking for last 1.5 hours on thalassemia. Number one, I must emphasize that it is a team approach. Whenever you have a thalassemia management, it is the pediatrician, the blood bank person, the endocrinologist, cardiologist, obstetrician, and a gynecologist. Even the role of a thalassemia society, social workers, all are put together when we are able to give a comprehensive treatment for the thalassemia management. Because what a cardiologist will pick up early, or an endocrinologist or a naturally everybody may not be able to pick up. You have asked me a very specific what are the drugs which can modify the gene. This observation came that the patients of thalassemia have a high fetal hemoglobin, and that is the reason why they present late at their presentation is late. Secondly, thalassemia major, who have a associated high fetal persistent hemoglobin, HbF levels, they also present late, and therefore, though they have a mutation, major mutation for thalassemia major, but if they have a mutation along with it, a high fetal persistent hemoglobin, so they also present late. So that was the one idea from where the people started working. And then they said, why can't we use certain drugs which can increase the HbF levels? Initially, the drugs which were used were dasatinib, azacitidine, Mylaran. But one must keep in mind, these are all drugs which are chemotherapeutic agents and were, though effective in about 30% of patients, either they will make him increase the hemoglobin level or they reduce the blood transfusion level. And in thalassemia, they may become even transfusion independent. Their hemoglobin may maintain about 8 or 9 grams. But these are the short-term studies. Naturally, because of a myelotoxicity, they could not be given for long term. One of the drugs, hydroxyurea, which has been used very extensively. Before we go on, because this drug has been used in patients with polycythemia vera, sickle cell disease, over years and years, and it is considered to be the safe one. And this drug has been used in children with thal major, thal intermedia, or NTBT, and where it has very clearly shown that at least in about nearly 50% of patients in NTBT, their hemoglobin will rise by 2 grams or so, and the patient will improve his activity and hemoglobin will be better. His all other parameters will become better. In patients with thal major, it might reduce the blood transfusion requirement. Then there are other drugs like arginine butyrate, isobutyrate have been used. They have been always short-term studies. They have helped, but they have not stood the test of time except hydroxyurea. People have used the drugs like to stimulate the erythropoietin, and which again, A being an expensive, B it is an injectable one. Some people have tried and the benefits are there, but not to an extent that it will stop the BT requirement. Another drug which has been used by some, for which I have a word of caution, some people have used thalidomide. Again, I feel it is an inpatient anti-cancer drug. It has improved in about 1/3 of patients with thal major. Small studies have shown that they become transfusion independent. In another 1/3, the transfusion requirement may go down. But one must keep in mind that these are the short-term studies. A drug like thalidomide, which acts on gonads, a drug which is required for thalassemia lifelong. I will not be the one which will support that one should use such drugs for lifelong in patients with thal major in these ones. The other drugs which have been used is the stetotrepsat or luprosat. Now these are the TGBs, betas ligand, which act at a late stage of erythropoiesis, and where it stimulates at the late stage of erythropoiesis, where this erythropoietic stem cell is stimulated, and therefore it produces more corrective erythropoiesis, and that is a level which acts. And there have been studies on luspatercept. Next slide will show you that about 59 patients, of which 28 are thalassemia dependent transfusion, 31 NTDT, and they have shown that patient with transfusion dependent thalassemia, 75% of patients responded, and over 30 where there was a reduction in the transfusion burden. And so therefore, these are the drugs which have been used. Similarly, it has been very effective in NTDT also. This is the drug which has been approved by FDA. It is to be given injectable. Unfortunately, the next slide, there a trial of sotatercept trial also, which also shows that patient with NTDT, there is an improvement in by increase in hemoglobin of 1 gram, and even in thalassemia dependent, transfusion dependent thalassemia also, there is a improvement in hemoglobin levels. But the question is that all these drugs, both of them are very expensive, and the drug luspatercept has been approved by FDA. Unfortunately, it is not available in this country, and even if it is made available, I have my doubts how many patients will be able to afford because of its cost factor. Can't hear Dr. Jagdish Chandra. Hello. Hello. Not audible.
Yes, sir, okay. Fine. Yes, sir, okay.
Not audible.
Sir, आप बोल सकते हो. It is audible.
I'm not able to hear you. Dr. Jagdish Chandra was speaking. I couldn't hear him.
Sorry, sir, आप बोलो.
All I said is that these are the drugs, new agents which have been used, and they are able to improve the thalassemia, and in about 30 to 40% of patient, transfusion requirement they become independent of transfusion, and in other 30%, it reduces the blood transfusion requirement. The only question is, these are the drugs which are expensive, they are injectable, and though they have been approved by FDA, they are not available in this country. And even if they are made available, I have my doubts how many patients will be able to afford of their own. Of course, one will need some financial assistance to them so that they can be given these drugs, newer agents.
Dr. Jagdish sir, please unmute your speaker. No, we are not able to hear you, sir. Please unmute.
While Dr. Jagdish unmutes him, Dr. Arora, I had a request.
Sir, it is unmuted, but not the...
Dr. Jagdish, we can't hear you. He is unmuted, but still we are not getting. Gunjan, you need to see.
Dr. Arora, can I make a request to you while Dr. Jagdish comes back online? Dr. Chaudhary has told us in detail about luspatercept, and there is a lot of excitement in the patient and parent community about this drug.
Yes.
The cost is prohibitive, but you see the company's key market is a different disease called myelodysplastic syndrome, because the patients of that disease, they have insurance cover, and their volume is 10 times more than thalassemics in the United States. So I think we will need the support groups to really push for an assistance program for thalassemia. We do not have insurance cover because it's a congenital disease, because this really drug has the potential to phenomenally change the management of thalassemia in the next decade. But we have to somehow, till a generic becomes available, we have to see if an access program specifically for thalassemics can be made available.
Yes, Dr. Amita, see, I think the cost will be around rupees 5 lakh Indian rupees for around 40-50 kg over thalassemia patient. It's very high. I think now they have moved from US to Europe. It has been introduced in Europe as well. So let us see, it may take another 6 months or 1 year or so. They will certainly come to us, because even with the XZ, the price when we got in India, it was 1/10 of the international price. So we are waiting to just exhaust their patience, because they will require us.
Their market is different. We want to fight for the thalassemics to get them a good price.
Madam, they have to come to us if they want business. So we have the market, they will provide, no problem. We'll just wait another year or so. They will come to us at 1/10 price at minimum.
Yes.
I'm sure. I think Dr. Jagdish is not audible. So next question was for me. So let me take at my own. Okay. So the next question was that some patients have been trapped away from the regular transfusion centers, and some hospitals have been converted as dedicated COVID-19 hospitals. How you are helping these patients? This was the question to be put to me for the next question. Okay. So I like to say, hello.
Can you put? Yeah, Gunjan can put the slide, next slide, if it is a slide.
It may be only question. No, I have not made any slides.
Hello.
Hello. It was a question. Doesn't take, because I have not prepared any slides. Let me speak. No problem.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think the most of the experts are here. In Delhi, especially you can say Lady Harding, Kalavati, GTB, many patients are from outside Delhi. They are from UP, Bihar, or you can say even MP, Haryana. So they are coming to Delhi, and many have been trapped over there because of sudden lockdown. So where to go? So what we have done, we have, you can say, created facility, or you can say introduced to them to the local government hospitals. Their blood banks are there, and we are getting good support from them. And some patients are still managing to come to Delhi, and they are getting transferred in Delhi as well. And Delhi itself, that Lok Nayak hospital has been converted into COVID-19 hospitals, and around 150 patients, they have been distributed to different hospitals wherever it is nearest to them, like GTB, Deen Dayal, or BSA. And I must thank Dr. Jagdish Chandra, Dr. Goombar, and all others who are supporting us, and they are giving treatment to these patients. However, there is some problem with the blood bank sharing the blood and cross-matching, but we are still solving that one. I hope we'll get it very soon. And we have problem with even Haryana. Some patients are taking PGI Rohtak, and they are trapped in Hisar and this other areas, Gurgaon. So there again, we have tied up with the local hospitals, Hisar and Sirsa specifically, Fatehbad, Sirsa. So there again, we have tried for the Hisar at least in some hospitals. Same is with the SGPGI Lucknow. So many patients who are going to Lucknow from different parts of UP. So from Aligarh, this Muradabad, Bulandshahr. So we have created some facilities at some level. And even we like that these patients to continue at the local level so that there should be less burden on the other hospitals. This is our first strategy. And the second question was, how to manage the funds for stem cell transplantation. See, I think you all know that Coal India Limited had provided around 20 crore for 200 thalassemia patients at the rate of rupees 10 lakh per patient who are less than 12 years of age and have HLA matched sibling donor available. So almost all patients have got it. Only few funds have been left. SGPGI Chandigarh and SGPGI Lucknow and PGI Chandigarh. So few patients can still be, or some AIIMS as well. But other centers have exhausted their funds. We are trying for the again reviving, or you can say reallocating the funds from the Coal India or some other PSU. We hope to get it. Earlier we have got information that they have added, but again because of COVID something happened, and it's just you can just stand it over there. So that was thing. And moreover, what our society does, in addition to this Coal India, all the thalassemia patients, they can have 3 lakh from the PM Relief Fund. And in some states, they have CM Relief Fund as well. In UP, it is 5 lakh. In Delhi also it is 5 lakh, but I don't know whether it has been released to anybody or not. But in UP, some people have got it. Even MP had started, and some other states also giving CM Relief Fund. In addition to that, as a National Thalassemia Welfare Society, what we are doing is, whenever a patient has HLA-matched donor available, and if the family is very poor, can't afford it, we support their pre-transfusion chelation by giving them Destrol, infusion pumps or chelations so that their iron level, ferritin level can be brought down. Secondly, to some patients, we have also had, even recently there is a family where from the UP, where both parents are handicapped, and another family from UP, from MP as well, Raipur. The 3-4 families. What we have done is, when they have to stay for 3 months after transplant near the transfusion transplant center, so we paid their 3 months rent, so that at least some part of their post-transplant expenses can be covered. So that way we are also helping the patients. The third
that's a wonderful thing, Doctor.
Yes,
Dr. You are doing a wonderful thing for the society. I have talked to Dr. Jagdish, and he says the last question was for Dr. Amita Mahajan on bone marrow transplantation and the role of bone marrow transplantation in this disease. If you can go ahead with this, madam.
Yes, sir. So I think we've discussed all modalities of how to manage a thalassemia, but unless gene therapy becomes really a reality, the only curative treatment for thalassemia is bone marrow or stem cell transplantation. The stem cell is, just a surrogate term for bone marrow, because most of the time we will take from bone marrow in patients. But in other diseases, sometimes we use stem cells from blood also and umbilical cord blood also. Could I go to the next slide? Now, the success of bone marrow transplant, this is the first report, because this is the center that has to date the maximum experience in thalassemia, Dr. Lucarelli Center in Italy. And this was there, as early as 1990, which is 30 years ago. You can see that in young patients, which was less than 17 years, they got an event-free survival of 75%. Next slide, sir. So the outcomes really depend on what is the status of the patient, and that is we want patients to go in for transplant when they are young and when they are in good situation. And for that, we have 3 features to look at. One, the adequacy of chelation that they have received throughout their life before they go to transplant. So the more better chelated you are, the higher the chances of a successful outcome. If you don't have significant liver enlargement, which is up to 2 centimeters, and absence of liver fibrosis. When we used to do a biopsy, but like Dr. Gomez suggested, we now have a tool called FibroScan, and the best place to use FibroScan in patients with thalassemia is to assess them for transplant. So if a patient has been adequately chelated, has no hepatomegaly, and has no liver fibrosis, this is a class 1 patient. And you can see below in the slide, the chances of successful transplant in such a patient, if done in early, say less than 10 to 12 years of life, the success approaches 90%. And as these factors increase, the successful outcomes of these patients decrease. Next slide. This again just shows, this is again a few years old. This is global data of all patients who have undergone transplant, class 1 and class 2, under 17 years of age, and again their outcomes are in excess of 85–88%. And this is from all matched sibling related donors. And only about 25 to 30% of our patients will have a matched sibling. In India, because frequently intra-community marriages happen, occasionally the parent may be a full match also. So for thalassemics, we always do from the parents as well, because maybe 2 to 3% will find a suitable match, fully matched donor from their parent. Next slide. So for the remaining 70%, there is no suitable donor. But now, in the last decade or so, the successful results with matched unrelated donor transplants have also become a reality. We have Indian registry called Datri, and there is another registry, and there are international registries. So if a patient who is a class 1 or class 2 patient can find a matched unrelated donor from the registry, that again can lead to a very successful outcome from the transplant. So that is now considered another standard option. The treatment regimen for these conditions have evolved to try and limit the toxicity of the transplant and the chances of a fatality with the transplant. So one treatment that was suggested was to reduce conditioning, maybe give a gentler therapy before transplant, but that hasn't worked out very well. But thiosulfan-based conditioning regimen has really helped to bring down transplant-related mortality. So just to make a point that a lot of things are being evolved within the transplanters community to improve the outcomes for these patients, even if we take up older children, even when we have class 3 patients, because most of our patients are class 3. Next slide. So this is published by the Thalassemia International Federation, the most recent data compiling everything, that the successful outcome with a matched sibling donor is 91% overall and 83% that they will have no recurrence of thalassemia. And as you can see, the matched related donor in expert hands really compares with matched family donor. So this has been a major development which makes it possible for many more patients to undergo transplant. But if there is a mismatch, or if we do a half-matched transplant from a family, the results are much lower. They are also getting better, but as of today, they are still much lower than that for a matched sibling donor or a matched, from a mud registry. Next slide. So these are the current summary recommendations about transplant from the international, the advisory community, that stem cell transplant should be offered to thalassemia patients at an early age before complications due to iron overload have developed if an HLA identical sibling is available. A matched unrelated donor transplant can be considered provided that there is a full match and high compatibility criteria for all HLA loci are present. Next. Unrelated cord blood transplant should only be considered in low-risk patients. The advisory actually recommends against using this unless it is in very experienced hands in experimental clinical trials. And also the stem cell transplant from an HLA mismatched family donor or a half-matched donor, or what we call haplotransplant, should still be considered within the context of a clinical trial in expert hands. Other regimens are evolving and they continue to be experimental. I think that is the last slide. So transplant, Dr. Arora has already cited that how can we make transplant accessible for these patients. There are a lot of different strategies to mobilize funds for these patients, and the support groups have really played a phenomenal role in making this happen.
What is the normal cost of this bone marrow transplant?
So the normal cost for a related transplant is can be up to about 15 lakhs, but like Dr. Arora said, for a matched family donor, about 10 lakhs can be given from the Coal India Foundation, and there are many others. So and this is not an urgent transplant. With every patient we can plan. So what we find is that with the CM Relief Fund, with the PM Relief Fund, with the Coal India Foundation, with so many other support groups helping and crowdfunding platforms, a patient need not be denied transplant because of cost. And cost for transplant is actually much lower than the cost of maintaining optimal transfusion chelation for lifelong for these patients. So the patient selection has to be good, and post-transplant care, because if it is the family, we can meet their finances, but educating the family about caring for this patient for about 12 to 18 months post-transplant by improving their chelation so that they are a very good candidate for transplant, those are actually our bigger challenges.
Okay. Now Dr. Jagdish Prasad Jagdish Chandra has joined back.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that interruption. So I think we have done all the questions. Dr. Arora also did his 2 questions. One last question that I had for Dr. Arora, and that is some good information for the listeners. That is, thalassemia has been included in the list of disabilities. Can Dr. Arora briefly please tell about what is the procedure of getting or issuing a disability certificate for these thalassemia patients? Dr.
Yes.
Arora, please.
Sir,
Okay.
also please add that what is the advantage of this disability certificate also.
All right. Yeah, sure.
So
Sure,
how
sir.
to get it and what is the advantage?
Okay,
How to
okay.
get it, how to give it, and what are the advantages?
Yes, yes. Okay. Because I last 2 questions I picked up at randomly because suddenly Dr. Jagdish Chandra was off the air. So first of all, I like to thank Dr. Naab, Dr. Smita Mishra, and IAP for organizing this webinar on International Thalassemia Day and associated with National Thalassemia Society. So I really thankful to them and all the participants of IAP who attended, and this panelist, Dr. Amita Mahajan, Dr. Sunil Gumba, Dr. Chaudhary, Dr. Mohammad Abdullah. So first of all, I like to thank all of them, because at that time it was an emergency. I immediately shifted to that questions. Okay, now coming to disability, in 2016, that is 18 December 2016, the Disability Act was passed, and luckily thalassemia was included in that. It is basically, I can't say luckily, reason being I fighted it personally, very frankly, for 20 years. I started in January 2006, 1996, and it took me 20 years to get it included in the list of disabilities for the RPWD Act. So now the first coming to question to Dr. Manas Kalra, what are the benefits? Excluding one benefit, all others are given to thalassemics. That is one benefit which is not available to blood disorders. That is job reservation in jobs. So blood disorders means thalassemia, sickle cell anemia, and hemophilia. They are not entitled for the job in reservation in jobs, but they have the entitled for the reservation in higher education and all other whatever the schemes government comes with the, because it is again going to the state government. If a state government wants to give priority in the land, priority in the loan, or low interest in the loan, whatever that the government decides, that will be available to thalassemics, excluding job reservation. That is the first thing I must tell you. And secondly, how to get it. So how to get it is they have to, it can be taken from two places, either at the home place, they are a residence, Aadhaar card. If the person is from say Bulandshahr or from Rohtak, if he is getting transfusion in Delhi in any center, he can get this disability certificate from both places, either from his CMO from his place of residence, or from the where he is taking the treatment. So best is where he is taking treatment. That is the best, because they have all the records and all the records, reports. They know everything about the patient. Because if he goes to his native place, they may ask so many things which he may not produce it. So it becomes difficult for that. For that, what they have to do is there is a form 4 is there. They have to, that is the application which they have to submit with the transfusion center or the CMO of the district, and form 4 with Aadhaar card, no other proof, only Aadhaar card, photo, and you can say the transfusion or either diagnosis or transfusion record. These three things to be submitted to the transfusion center. The transfusion center has to give certificate within 30 days. Either give it or refuse it. They can't say, okay, we'll see to it. Within 30 days, either they have to give it or they have to mention why they are not giving it, and they have to refuse it. You are not entitled for that. Now, what is the criteria of scoring? See, if it is a thalassemia minor or sickle cell minor, they are not entitled for that. It is less than 40%. If it is thalassemia major, transfusion dependent, or even anti-DT on irregular transfusion, or maintaining on a hydroxyurea, or you can say they will be given 40% plus. But if that patient has some complications like osteoporosis, hepatitis B, C, HIV, cardiac complications, or other things, then accordingly that different percentage is there. As of now, the notification issued on 4th January 2018, there are 9 criteria for the scoring, which we were not happy. We had taken a matter with the health ministry as well as the social welfare ministry, and they are taking it. But till that, it is the only criteria which is mentioned in the notification of January 4, 2018, and it is given according to that only. So this is about disability certificate and how to get it.
Thank you so much, Dr. J.S. Arora. Can we have some questions, sir? Dr. Jagdish, can we have?
Yes. There are some questions. So,
regarding disability, may I say something?
One very interesting question for Dr. Amita. You could answer that. If both facilities are available, like bone marrow transplant as well as transfusion chelation therapy, which is preferable?
Sir,
that's a very interesting question. Yes.
If the patient has a fully matched sibling donor, we would strongly recommend to go for transplant. If there is no fully matched donor, then of course they have to, we show them the latest data and they discuss, but it should be strongly recommended when there is a fully matched donor and, the other aspects can be taken care of. Like we said, the cost, because the cost to the state for a transplant is actually lesser than the cost of optimal transfusion and chelation. However, a family, they may not be ready to accept even 5% risk, that is their personal outlook, but as physicians, we would strongly recommend if there is a matched sibling donor.
Right, all right. So thank you. There is one question on, do you monitor reactions after transfusion? Certainly the transfusion reaction is monitored every time the child receives transfusion. Another question is that why HB electrophoresis is not useful for picking alpha thalassemia. Dr. Sunil Gombar, would you like to take on this question? Or Dr. Amita? I think the alpha thalassemia is picked up more with the HPLC rather than electrophoresis. There is an early peak that you get in HPLC curves rather than the electrophoresis. So, what is the difference between management of heart failure associated with thalassemia major and without cardiac iron overload? Dr. Sunil Gombar, the difference between the management of thalassemia with iron overload and without iron overload.
Well, as I said, may I take this question? Hello?
Yes?
May I take this question?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, sure, yes.
It is addressed to you only.
This is a question again put by Dr. Smita only. And you see, as I said, in thalassemia, the first thing is the restrictive cardiomyopathy. And you have a diastolic dysfunction. So in patients who have got diastolic dysfunction or restrictive cardiomyopathy, digoxin is not a preferred drug. The preferred drug would be an ACE inhibitor. And if I am correct to say, you should not be using, as I also mentioned in that talk, that digoxin should not be used. Yes, if there is no thalassemia major, then the digoxin could also be one of the drugs to be used in heart failure. The other thing I would like to say here is Dr. Smita, if she is around, there were one or two, she has put the SPECT. We would also like to know something about the spectral decompatibility.
Yeah, I think Dr. Smita Mishra is she there on the right now? Is she there? She can. She has written 2 comments rather than the questions. So
she's there.
Yeah,
she is
so
there.
she could elaborate on that regarding ECG and tissue Doppler and speckle strain. Dr. Smita Mishra, are you listening?
No, she's not listening, but she's there.
Just a minute.
Hi,
Okay.
yes, come.
Okay, fine.
Come on the screen, madam.
Yes.
It's little difficult to connect me. Huh? Okay. So that is what I wanted to say, that nowadays because of, can you hear me?
Yes, you
Can
are
you hear
audible.
me?
Yes, yes,
So
yes.
the echo is a better modality and less cumbersome. And the traditional echo is not very helpful, but now because of this stress strain calculation which you make in the tissue Doppler, they are very, very helpful, and they have been correlated with the MRI finding. T2 star. So that also can be used to evaluate the cardiac, the iron load of heart. So that is very helpful. That one, and the secondly about the arrhythmia, because lot of sudden cardiac cases of sudden cardiac death in thalassemia are because of the propensity for going into arrhythmias. Arrhythmia because you have high LVEDP, as said by Dr. Gombar, the LA wall is very stiff because of deposition of the iron, and also the vascular walls are also very stiff. So in these cases, sometimes ACE inhibitor may not be very useful. So we have to be very careful about that. And about the arrhythmia, of course, the hypertension is also because of this. Sorry, the thalassemia associated pulmonary hypertension is also because of that. So in pulmonary hypertension, you may have high LVEDP, one, and the secondly, stiffness of the vasculature. So these are the few cardiac point about the thalassemia major, and I was really surprised. Thank you, Dr. Arora, for this webinar. When I was reading, there's so much about the thalassemia major and the cardiac issues, because ultimately the demise of patient and sudden cardiac death is always the reason of the bad outcome of a thalassemia patient. So cardiac points are very, very important, and they like the iron chelation therapy becomes one of the most important thing while dealing with the heart failure in a patient of thalassemia. So these are the few comments. Thank you.
Also interesting is the fact when we talk about NTDT versus TDT, in NTDT, pulmonary hypertension and the tricuspid valve regurgitation velocity is more important on an echo, and it is not commonly seen in the TDT patients. So you know that there is also an interesting thing that for TDT and NTDT, echo and how we interpret the echo, what we look at the echo is also different. So that is also something, you know, unique about the thalassemia and heart.
Yeah, that's right. So just one last question. One last question is regarding, are there any complications of ischemectomy other than infections? Certainly, yes. The chronic complications associated with the ischemectomy include increased chances of thrombosis, increased pulmonary hypertension. So these are two important complications of ischemectomy other than the infection. One comment has come that disability certificate can be taken from transfusion center, and I am receiving transfusion from Apollo Hospital. Can Apollo Hospital give a certificate, and that would be eligible everywhere? Like transfusion given, probably he wants to know if the certificate is issued by a private hospital, is that accepted in everywhere?
Can I answer this question?
I like to answer
Dr.
this
Arora,
question.
please.
Yes, I like to answer this question. See, certificate can be given by a private hospital wherever the child is taking transfusion, but that has to be countersigned by a government institute, which is must.
All right. Okay. All right. So I think with this we conclude this very interesting session. Though there was some technical problem from my side. I am handing over to you, sir. I am handing over to you. I would just like to thank the Delhi IAP and all my panelists, Dr. Arora, for giving me this opportunity to conduct this as a moderator. Thank you. Over to Dr. Nav.
Sir, I had a question for the panel. Like nowadays, you know, private companies have come up and they are collecting cord blood, and they say they preserve it for a number of years, you know, 10 years, 20 years. If some problem arises, is it helpful? Even in thalassemia, is it of some help?
Shall I answer this?
Yeah. Anyway.
जो regular patients के लिए cord blood collection or storage is not recommended at all. Now for thalassemic, related cord blood can be helpful, but usually the stem cell yield is very less. So that is sufficient only for a very small child. But for a thalassemic at least, we can consider storage of cord blood, but it should be done properly with the cord blood bank that has quality control. Our problem has been that we have stored it, but it has not been of any use because they're not collected it properly. The stem cell dose is less, or the proper sterility measures have not been taken. So for non-thalassemic patient or non-hematological disorder, cord blood storage is not recommended at all. For thalassemics, yes, they can consider it. Previously, we thought that if there is mismatch, we can use cord blood. But no, only for fully matched, we can use cord blood as an adjunct to stem cells, and that has to be discussed with their hematologist properly.
Thank you very much, madam.
Most of the cord blood that are collected and stored are actually very poor quality. So better not to waste money in that.
Okay. And moreover, it requires 100% match, which even otherwise we can take from the donor after that.
True, very true. Okay, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Jagdish C.
Thank you.
I'm thankful to each and every panelist. They have taken out their precious time, and we are here, you are here with us. I'm thankful to Dr. J.S. Arora, the Secretary General of National Thalassemia Welfare Society. It was a wonderful session. We have become wiser. I think everyone in the audience must have become wiser on this issue. Thank you so much. But before stopping, I'll use this platform. Actually, IFA Delhi is going to have a big conference, PCNI and DIPED 2020 on 10th and 11th of October. I wish and pray to God that this pandemic is over by that time and we have a physical meeting. So I suggest the audience, those who have not registered themselves, kindly get yourself registered. The registration fees is just the same what it was earlier. We have not increased it so far. So
give the money back.
Not expected.
Give the money back.
No, we'll, money is given, we'll give them what.
Will you give the money back?
No, money will not be given back, but that will be utilized fully. If we are not able to conduct physical meetings, definitely we will have a big webinars.
Yeah. So आपको meeting की जगह 20 webinar free मिलेंगे sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you sir. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Thank you, Manas. Thank you, Dr. J. Sharma. Thank you, Samita.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you so much, all of you. Thank you. Thank you, Mujan, for the support you have given. Tremendous. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay.